in India. I am delighted to welcome you to today's global launch of Professor Andrew Coyle's book, Prisons of the World. Professor Coyle is Emeritus Professor at the University of London with decades of experience in prison management, but also research, advocacy for reform and humane innovation, as well as deep scholarship and teaching for which he is renowned and respected internationally. A bit about the book, and then I will ask Professor Coyle to speak. Prisons of the World, as the title suggests, is wide in its majestic sweep and scope, deep in its research and intent, and powerful in its call to action. It's also striking in its rather quite common sense approach, which informs and educates the reader, for it is aimed not at preaching to the converted, but reaching a wider audience. Many of us may know that about 11 million men, women, and children are imprisoned across the world. That's the population of a number of countries like Cuba, Greece, Belgium, or Portugal. And many of those in prison are held in inhumane conditions. Of course, there are serious criminal offenders who make national and international headlines. But these are a tiny fraction of the overall number of inmates in any jail system. Indeed, the great majority will be people who live on the periphery of society, engaging in what governments determine as low level or petty offenses, which is really part of their efforts to survive in what to them is a chaotic, unequal world. Many in prison suffer from mental illness, and many live outside of official institutional systems, unable or incapable of obtaining stable jobs, often homeless, and in strained relationships with their families, public health, and social services. In several cases, the mentally ill women, especially, and men are invisible to helpful social or health services. They come to the forefront when they're accused of committing a crime, and the criminal justice system is the only area of the official network where they can be found. While individuals working for prison reforms within the system, as well as academics and others who research and comment on them from the outside, need to continue their efforts, Professor Coyle, in his book, insists that fundamental change cannot be realized through these methods alone. He points out time and again that genuine change for the greater good is more likely to occur if many of the resources which are spent today in what he calls the demand-led jail industry are delivered to projects such as justice reinvestment and in the long run through the human development model. Professor Coyle points to the justice reinvestment movement because he believes that it has begun to signal the end of an over-reliance on criminal justice. It may also herald deeper systemic reforms which recognize that resolving public safety issues requires a collaboration not just within government, but with civil society institutions, such as those organizations working in health and housing. You need workforce development as well as child and family welfare. And to date, he points out, the justice reinvestment efforts that have been launched have tended to focus on reallocating current resources from criminal justice to social and community programs. That's not enough. A more radical strategy is required. And at CHRI, we are delighted to be associated with the book's release and with this event, for we have worked on prison reforms, especially in India and across the Commonwealth since 1995. During these years, more than a quarter century, we have worked to improve prison conditions through strengthened prison monitoring, taken steps to highlight issues that relate to pretrial detention and improve access to legal aid for people in custody. We've also worked to secure the rights of vulnerable prisoners, including women, transgender, and foreign nationals in incarceration. To do so, we work and engage with stakeholders, government think tanks, and organizations such as legal aid authorities and networks, as well as the national human rights institutions. We've achieved some success in our work. Of course, it is never enough, and it is never enough. But especially in COVID times, I want to point out our monitoring checklists were adopted by several states. And we've also collated probably the only source of information on COVID infections in prisons in India and tracked overcrowding. Our close engagement with state prison departments and training institutes have sensitized prison staff, and it's also succeeded in streamlining documentation processes by legal aid institutions. I'd like to highlight that through the persistent efforts of our determined colleagues, more than 800 foreign national prisoners have been successfully repatriated. In his book, and I'm going to stop very soon and hand it over to Professor Coyle to talk about his book, not just, this is just the foreword. He underlines this approach, which is reflected, as I said earlier, in the philosophy of human development. Indeed, Sustainable Goal 16 is at the heart of the work that we do, and that is absolutely critical and at the heart also of the work that Professor Coyle is doing, and at the book, and at the heart of the book, the core of the book. So may I request Professor Coyle to come in here and talk about his work, his focus, and the book. Thank you.
Sanjoy, thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. And many thanks to you and to all your colleagues at the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative for organizing and hosting this event. As we've just heard, the specific occasion for our gathering is the launch of the book, Prisons of the World. But more importantly, it is also a platform to highlight and discuss some features of imprisonment around the world. And that was why I was delighted to accept the offer from CHRI to arrange this launch. First, because CHRI has a genuinely international reach, as is demonstrated by the spread of our audience today. And also because this emphasizes that the book is about much more than the closed world of prisons. In the introduction to the book, I write, "This book is not a penal travelogue, nor is it simply a book of penology or of criminology. It certainly raises many issues which are germane to those two academic disciplines, as well as to others, such as anthropology, sociology, and political science, but it goes much further. Through reference to many examples of how imprisonment is used in different continents and cultures, it poses questions about how governments and societies use and misuse imprisonment as a response to a variety of underlying and fundamental social problems. In a sentence, the book highlights important and complex social and indeed moral issues which are deserving of considered political and public debate. The linking thread of the book is my personal journey of almost 50 years, which began with over 2 decades working in high security prisons in the United Kingdom, and has continued by inspecting and advising on prisons in over 70 countries. For some considerable time, I have thought that at some point I should place on public record some of my experiences in prisons around the world. And that is what this book does. For example, by describing the men and women whom I met in them, by asking some fundamental questions about the use which we make of imprisonment in so many countries today, as well as by questioning what should be its future in the 21st century. In the book, I have not attempted to provide a comprehensive review of all the world's prison systems. Rather, I have selected a number of countries and regions which serve to demonstrate particular key issues and dilemmas, both within the prison environment and also which affect wider social and political attitudes. I describe what I found, for example, in prisons in Russia and in other countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia as they slowly emerged from the terrible legacy of the all-pervasive Gulag system of Soviet times. In Cambodia, as it came to terms with the aftermath of the horrific years of the Khmer Rouge terror. In the prisons of China and Japan, where there are soul-crushing levels of discipline, where the movement of every individual is monitored and punishments are harsh. In South African prisons, in the immediate aftermath of the apartheid era, and in other countries in Southern Africa, where there are shocking levels of overcrowding and lack of basic necessities. In Latin America, which has some of the most lawless prisons in the world, cesspits of violence, exacerbated by the deadly influence of all-powerful gangs, with violence which seeps through the prison walls into the communities of the poor and back again. Although I also describe one ray of hope from the Dominican Republic. Writing the book in this way has inevitably meant that there are a number of obvious omissions. For example, there is little discussion of the situation in South Asia, where India, as we shall shortly hear, has one of the lowest rates of imprisonment in the world, yet one of the highest proportions of pre-trial prisoners. In a similar vein, much could have been written about the history and current use of imprisonment in Australia and New Zealand, especially in respect of the treatment of their indigenous citizens. And across the wider European region, there are significant variations, both in the level of use of imprisonment, as well as in the nature of its delivery in a number of countries which are close neighbours. The book also describes specific problems which exist in many countries. For example, an excess of pre-trial and remand prisoners held in intolerable conditions in many countries. Increasing numbers of mentally ill prisoners, for example, in the United Kingdom. Men held for years in solitary confinement in North America. Older prisoners in Japan, men and women who commit petty crimes in order to be sent to prison, where they will receive the basic social care which is not available for them in the community. Increasing numbers of foreign national prisoners in several European countries and elsewhere. And in an important chapter, I describe the experiences of the 7% of the world's prisoners who are women, explaining how those whom I refer to as the forgotten minority are treated within prison systems that are designed primarily by and for men. Having discussed the futility and failings of the prison in many countries, the final chapter of the book offers some positive pointers for the future. Taking up the plea of Václav Havel, former president of the Czech Republic, who wrote to his wife from his prison cell about his experiences and the need to find what he described as a better way of coming to terms with certain things. I go on to suggest that the real change for the wider benefit of society is only likely to come about if many of the resources which are currently invested in the demand-led imprisonment industry are substantially transferred to initiatives such as those which have come to be described as justice reinvestment and the human development model. These are initiatives which, in the words of the United Nations, will be based on the principle of expanding the richness of human life, rather than simply the richness of the economy in which human beings live. To express this in another way, such an approach will have a positive focus on future improvement, in contrast to the criminal justice approach, which has a retrospective focus on the reduction of crime. A proper application of this approach along the lines proposed in the book could provide a way out of the vicious circle of an ever-increasing use of criminal justice systems, which are very expensive in fiscal terms and also detrimental in terms of human development. Thank you for listening to me. Now back to Sanjoy.
Thank you, Professor Coyle. Would you like to hold up your book so that we can all see it? Because I think it's important. If you are launching it, we must see the book. So,
if you send it to me, I will sign you a copy. Thank you very much, Sanjoy.
That's wonderful. Thank you for those very illuminating remarks. And before I introduce our very distinguished panel, I just wanted to reflect on one thing, because Professor Coyle, throughout his book and in his remarks, reflected on and urged the human development method. And I want to just look at Sustainable Goal 16.3, which is about promoting the rule of law at national and international levels and ensuring equal justice, access to justice for all. But the second of the indicators of 3 is critical to our discussion today. And it is that unsentenced detainees, it wants to focus on the reduction of unsentenced detainees as a proportion of overall prison population. Let me just briefly introduce our distinguished panel, and afterwards I'll outline the structure of the program that will follow. Our first panelist is Professor Catherine Hurd, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Crime and Justice Policy Research, which is the ICPR, at the School of Law in Birkbeck University in London. At ICPR, she directs the World Prison Research Program, which is a very well-known and well-established program started in 2016 to explore and build on the substantial body of quantitative data, which is held on ICPR's World Prison Brief database. That's a very well-known and respected database and widely used. Professor Hurd will present highlights from her recently completed project, Understanding and Reducing the Use of Imprisonment Worldwide, which examined aspects of how imprisonment is used and with what effects in 10 contrasting jurisdictions across 5 continents. And at CHRI, we're very happy that we were able to collaborate to some degree with that. Professor Hurd has a degree in classics from Cambridge University and qualified as a solicitor in 1992, worked in commercial litigation before moving to criminal justice. And before taking up her current role, she held positions at the NGO Fair Trials, the Law Commission of England and Wales, and the Center for Crime and Justice Studies. She'll be followed by Justice Lokur and Gilbert Mithula from Kenya, and I'll introduce them separately. Professor Hurd, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Sanjoy, and thanks for the promotion. I'm afraid I'm nowhere near a professor, but thank you very much for introducing the work of our World Prison Research Programme at ICPR. I was delighted that the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative are launching the book today, hosting this wonderful launch event, because as you pointed out, CHRI have been a key partner in our recent prisons research, and you do vital work in the field of incarceration and the human rights of prisoners. Before I reflect on Andrew's wonderful book, I'd like to say a few words about our prisons research at ICPR. because the program was itself born out of the very successful International Centre for Prison Studies, which Andrew established. I first met Andrew in, I think it was 2016, when he invited me to lunch, and I was still very new in my role heading up ICPR's new World Prison Research Programme. And that came about following the merger between two research centres, ICPS, which I just mentioned Andrew established, and ICPR, which is now part of Birkbeck. So that's where I am, ICPR. Sorry for all the acronyms. But yeah, at that time, I was new to academia, having worked, as you said, as a lawyer for most of my career. So when we met, I was really just a few weeks into that role, and I was immersing myself in the world of prisons, prison research, and penal policy. And I was beginning to chart the direction of this new program of research. And one of the sort of major planks of our research program, sort of then as now, is the World Prison Brief. And you mentioned, Sanjoy, the headline figure of 11+ million prisoners in the world. We wouldn't have that figure without the World Prison Brief. It's a gem of a resource, a completely unique database for which I can take no credit. It was set up 20 years ago. But it now provides data on almost every country in the world. And it was Andrew who gave Roy Walmsley the opportunity to set up the World Prison Brief when he was originally putting the data together at the UK Home Office. And it was Andrew who sort of took it over into the International Centre for Prison Studies and gave it its own website at King's College. So it's gone from strength to strength since then, and the website now gets, I think it's over 1 million hits a year, with its data relied on by policymakers, journalists, researchers, international agencies such as the UN bodies, the Red Cross, NGOs and activists across the world. So it's a really important resource in terms of highlighting the overuse of imprisonment and the unsustainable rises in prisoner numbers that we've seen in modern times. And I mean, another example of Andrew's lasting contribution to our prisons research program is his authorship of the brilliant Handbook, A Human Rights Approach to Prisons Management. And that's now in its 3rd edition, which completely updated for the Nelson Mandela rules and now co-authored by Andrew and my colleague Helen Fair on the team at ICPR. And this is still the go-to guide on better prisons management. It's been translated into many, many languages, and it's used by prison staff throughout the world. And just the other day, a contact of mine in Thailand, who's researching forced drug treatment sites around Asia, asked me, where can I find all the international standards on inspection and monitoring of detention sites? And I said that there's a whole chapter on it in the handbook. And he said that that was a complete godsend because it brought everything together in one place and, contained not only the rules themselves, but also practical examples of how they should be applied. And it's capable of addressing what is currently a real black hole, which is forced drug treatment sites. Anyway, so since that day in 2016, I've been working hard to build on that legacy and establishing a program of policy-oriented comparative research on prisons and the use of imprisonment. And our most ambitious project so far has been the one you mentioned, Sanjoy, which for short we call the 10-country prisons project. That's involved working with many, many partners across a very diverse group of 10 countries, which included India and England and Wales, and among others. And we looked at themes such as prisoner health and healthcare, the impacts of COVID-19 on prison regimes and daily life in prisons, the law and practice around pre-trial detention and sentencing, and the whole array of factors that drive prison population change. And the scope of what we did in the project and its impact were hugely enhanced by the partners that we had, people like Madhurima at CHRI, who shared with us her team's prison healthcare findings, and Gilbert Mithula who you'll hear from in a second, who interviewed Kenyan defense lawyers for us and helped us identify all the relevant bail and sentencing laws for Kenya. So we did that across 10 countries, and our research also included a big lived experience component. So we interviewed many people, and many of the prisoners, ex-prisoners and prisoners' loved ones who we interviewed in Brazil, South Africa, Kenya, the Netherlands, Hungary, provided us with evidence of many of the problems that Andrew describes in this book. Like Andrew, we found prisons built for hundreds, holding thousands, cells designed for one, occupied by three, communal cells holding upwards of 30 people or even more, prisoners being locked up in their cells for 22, 23 hours a day just for want of enough staff to supervise them, long queues of women visitors holding bags of clothing and food for their relatives who were desperate for that sustenance that they weren't providing within the prison system. You know, prisoners waiting months for visits because their families couldn't afford to travel to the prisons because they were located too far from their homes. People stuck in pre-trial detention for far too long because there weren't enough staff or vehicles to get them to court hearings, or because their cases just got lost in the system. Prisoners unable to access even basic healthcare, whether before or during the pandemic, and staff numbers too low and facilities too poor to provide even safety in prison, let alone support all the things we think prison is for, you know, rehabilitation, resettlement. So, as Andrew has himself always recognized, and as the book makes crystal clear, it's society's weakest who suffer from the state's failures to provide decent justice systems. And this points to a pressing need for every government and all communities to ask who is in prison and why are they there? And then to think long and hard about what that reveals about our social, political, and economic structures, because it's clear that the overuse of imprisonment, which is a relatively modern phenomenon, just perpetuates state and structural violence, entrenches inequality, and steals resources away from building stronger communities. And I'm happy to say that our prison research findings from the 10 countries project and the World Prison Brief are having a real impact now. They've been relied on by the UN Secretary General committees in the drafting of a UN body's common position on incarceration, which was published earlier this year. And we're attracting more and more grant funding for our comparative research. We'll be working on 2 new projects over the coming years, one examining prison labor and its ethical dimensions, and the other exploring the colonial legacy of petty offences across the Commonwealth and how they criminalise poverty, status and identity. Unlike many of the academics I've come across in this field, Andrew has brought with him a massive amount of hands-on experience, which, as Sanjoy said, he obtained over many, many years working at the coalface of prisons practice. And it's the wisdom that that experience produces that, for me, really shines out from the pages of this book and what makes it such a compelling read. So thank you, Andrew, for this important contribution to the field. And thanks once again to our hosts at CHRI for the vital work that you do upholding human rights standards across the Commonwealth. And in this time of reduced governmental support for civil society organisations like yours, I want to say that we at ICPR and Birkbeck stand with you in your fight to uphold basic rights and freedoms for all. Thank you.
Thank you for those words of support and very a very brief but in-depth review of the work you've done across 10 countries, and it's a huge, monumental effort by your team. And I'm sure that it would be and should be used not just by civil society, but by governments. And as you yourself have said, the Secretary General has taken it on board and is using it in drafting policy. I did not speak deliberately of the many leadership roles that Andrew Coyle has had in his long and distinguished career, because I knew that, somebody like yourself would fill that very important gap, because it was sort of deliberate. I also see and wish to welcome and recognize Dr. Patricia Perez, former Justice Minister from Chile, who was actually the Human Rights Minister for Chile. But I'd really like at some time later after the panel, she will be coming in, and also a colleague of mine, Madhurima Dhanuka from CHRI after the panel. I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Justice Mandan B. Lokur, who is a former judge, a very distinguished judge of the Supreme Court of India, and who was also a judge of the Supreme Court of Fiji. He was appointed as the Additional Solicitor General of India in 1998, a judge of the Delhi High Court the next year, and was the Chief Justice of Guwahati High Court and of the High Court of the state of Andhra Pradesh. Appointed as a judge of the Supreme Court in 2012, he retired in December 2018. Justice Lokur, apart from those dry facts, is highly respected for his pioneering judgments on women and children in conditions of incarceration, on detention centers and conditions there, as well as his resounding rulings upholding individual rights in the face of state arbitrariness and in cases of violence, custodial violence, and killings by the state forces. So, Justice Lokur, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Sanjoy. Thank you. Well, we've had ups and downs, but mostly downs in prison reforms in India. And I would like to speak a little bit about it. Andrew has mentioned in his book about overcrowding of prisons in India. Well, that's one of the problems. There are several others, but I would just like to briefly touch upon some of them. It was sometime in the 1970s that the Supreme Court recognized something which we today call dignity jurisprudence relating to the rights of prisoners. That even though a person has been convicted of a crime and he's serving time in a prison, it does not denude him of all his fundamental rights. Of course, that person cannot, go out of prison whenever he feels like it. So there is a restriction on freedom of movement. But otherwise, the fundamental rights that have been guaranteed under our constitution are available to him. And one of them is the dignity of the individual. So in the early years, that is in the 1970s and 1980s, something like, handcuffing of prisoners was prohibited. Of course, those days we didn't have terrorism, but today, perhaps if a terrorist was to be produced from custody, he would be handcuffed. We also abolished the use of bar fetters. Now, I have seen persons in bar fetters when I was in law school, and let me tell you, it's something, it's hugely degrading. And fortunately, the Supreme Court has abolished the use of bar fetters. It's not even used, against terrorists. Solitary confinement was abolished by the Supreme Court on the ground that it causes acute mental stress and it's inhuman and degrading. There were instances of torture which, had been brought to the notice of the Supreme Court by prisoners who were serving, very long sentences. And they heard in their ward persons being tortured by prison officials. So they brought it to the notice of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has, of course, said that there cannot be any torture of prisoners, however grave the crime may be. So there have been these kind of, very important decisions that were taken. But then later on, there was a hiatus, and in the sense that some improvements were made, but the general situation did not improve. So we had instances where, something like telephone facilities were provided to prisoners in some jails, particularly in Delhi, so that they could talk to their family under, specific conditions. Visits of members of the family were increased so that they could be in touch with their family. And, these kind of changes were brought about. But like Andrew has mentioned, overcrowding was a huge problem always. And I remember dealing with a public interest litigation regarding the prisons in India. That public interest litigation, incidentally, was initiated on the basis of a letter that was sent by a former Chief Justice of India to say that he had come to know that conditions in prisons were pretty horrible. And that case was entrusted to me as a public interest litigation. And I found that overcrowding was, of course, a huge problem. We have had instances last year, for example, when it was found that, more than twice the number of people who should be in custody were there in some of the prisons. In some places, it was as high as 300%. In some of them, it was 400%. So you can imagine the extent of overcrowding. But generally, it is said to be about 1.1%, 110% or 115% overcrowding. But the critical problem really is of persons who are under trial prisoners or persons who are pre-trial prisoners. So cases are pending against them. They've not yet been convicted, but they're in custody. And the figure that was mentioned last year officially was in the region of about 69%. But CHRI has now found that despite the COVID, when I would assume crime had reduced, the number of under trial prisoners has gone up to 75%, from 69% to 75, more than 75. But that's not all India, that's in most of the states across the country. And the unfortunate aspect is that many of them, many of these persons are in custody for years. It could be 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. Recently, a lawyer who was accused of, a terrorist offense, for example, was just released a few days ago after having spent 3 years in custody without a trial. So this is really something which is, not very satisfactory at all. But we had to deal with it, and we laid down certain rules. We initiated something called under trial review committees, which meant that prison officials, the police officials, legal aid authorities, and so on, the district administration, the collectors and commissioners would meet once a month to find out whether a person should actually remain in custody or should be released. Unfortunately, the directions were not taken very seriously. For the first couple of months, of course, the under trial review committees did meet and did release some people, but they were very conservative in passing release orders. And because of COVID, more or less the under trial review committees got disbanded. We also had a look at the number of suicides that were taking place in prisons. Very high number of suicides. So one wonders, where does a prisoner get the material, to commit suicide? Most of the cases were of hanging. They would hang themselves from somewhere, but then from where do they get the rope? And do they manage it only with bed sheets, or how do they manage it? This was a huge problem of prison administration. We had a look at training of prison staff, strengthening the number of persons in various positions, so that the prison administration could be more humane and would be for the betterment of the prisoners. We also then persuaded the government. The government had started something called a model prison manual, but it was really on the back burner, so to speak. But then we were able to push the government to come out with a model prison manual, and that came out with inputs from a lot of social activists and others who had been working on prison reforms. But we also said that the prison manual should be reviewed at the end of 1 year, so that if there are some mistakes or if there are some gaps, those can be filled up. But unfortunately, it's been 3 years now, or maybe 4 years, but the model prison manual has not been revisited by the authorities. COVID-19, of course, had its own impact. The Supreme Court said that parole should be granted to prisoners. It should be liberalized, the rules of parole, but not implemented in letter and spirit. Many persons did not get parole. Vaccinations were given to some prisoners, to quite a few actually, maybe about 160,000 prisoners were given vaccinations, but many of them were left out. Fortunately, there was no serious outbreak of the COVID pandemic in prisons. Otherwise, with the overcrowding and all that, problems of hygiene, it would have been a complete mess. But fortunately, that did not happen. Two problems where I think we need to, look at far more in depth is that of legal aid. I'm afraid legal aid is not being provided, even though it's a constitutional mandate under the Constitution of India. Legal aid is not being provided effectively. It is being provided, but not effectively, to persons who are in prison. So many of them, just because they're in prison, they're not able to argue their case or not able to contact their lawyer and to provide instructions. So things like bail, get delayed, trials get delayed. Sometimes the prison officials don't bring the accused person to the court, for recording the evidence of the prosecution. So there are all sorts of reasons, why cases are being delayed. And unless legal aid is provided to the prisoners, that situation will continue. Incidentally, prisoners in India are entitled to 100% free legal aid and advice. But, because of, I suppose, the quality of legal aid that is being offered, very few prisoners are availing of this facility. And there is a lack of initiative on the part of the legal aid authorities to provide legal assistance. The second area, which we were encouraging, by the way, when we were hearing the case in the Supreme Court, was that of open prisons. Now, open prisons have been fairly successful in one particular state, in the state of Rajasthan. It's been fairly successful. I had visited an open prison in another state, in the state of Himachal Pradesh. In fact, the prisoners were running a canteen, not a canteen, but a restaurant. So I went and had coffee over there. And it was a very good system, and I wanted to encourage it. There are some persons who are working on open prisons, trying to encourage it, but the feeling is that, well, prisoners should be in custody. So I think we have to get over that hang up and somehow or the other encourage, prison reforms by introducing more and more open prisons. I think Andrew has also referred to open prisons, but in a different context. The last point that I want to make is that, we have a lot of children who are in custody. Unfortunately, attention has not been paid to them. So while all our focus is on adult prisoners, women prisoners, the children of women prisoners, but children who are in custody as accused of an offense or having been found guilty of an offense, there has been no work done on that. And I think, the situation being what it is in India with regard to prisons, I would expect that the observation homes where children are housed, their condition would be much, much worse than what it is in adult prisons. But maybe that's for another day. So yes, this is all that I have to say. And thank you very much for your patience. Sanjoy.
Thank you, Justice Lokur, as always, very illuminating, very to the point, and very such depth. I'm just looking at those 3 points that you made at the end, the quality and quantity of legal aid, accessible, good legal aid. The second being open prisons, and it'll be interesting to hear from our other speakers and maybe the others, who, Dr. Perez and Madhurima, who speak from the floor. Any questions on that? Any points that people have to, and the children in custody, because I think until the age of 5 or 6, children who are in custody, or shall I say, whose mothers are in custody, can be with their mother. But after that, they have to be sent away to shelters or different homes, and it's a very difficult situation for them if they're not taken back to their larger families. So thank you for raising those very, very critical points. We come to our third panelist, is Gilbert Mithula, who holds a Bachelor of Law degree from the University of Nairobi, and a Master of Science in Comparative and International Education from St. Anthony's College at Oxford. He's passionate about criminal law and criminal justice reforms, and a particular interest in the right to legal representation and how this affects fair trial and access to justice. Gilbert is managing partner of Mithula, Shako and Associates Advocates, which is a socially conscious law firm in Kenya, and he's the founder of Africa Justice and Restoration Trust, which offers pro bono legal representation for remand prisoners in Kenya. He's also the chairperson of Association of Criminal Pro Bono Lawyers of Kenya, which is the premier society working and driving really pro bono criminal lawyers in Kenya to offer their services and participate in strategic litigation in criminal law. He's won a number of awards, and he's also a law lecturer. And this year, he's a nominee for the Lawyer of the Year Award in LSK Nairobi Awards, Legal Awards. So Gilbert, please come in now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to pick up from where Justice Lokur left, and that's on the question of pretrial detention. I'll try and focus what I'm saying on 3 points, just so that we can all follow. The first point is on pretrial detention in Kenya and what it's like. The second point on courts within or beside prisons and how to handle how terror suspects are handled. And then lastly, on technology in prisons and COVID responses in relation to that. I wrote an article for the 10 the 10-country research project that Catherine has just made reference to. And the article I wrote essentially talked about the common situation that we see across pretrial detainees. And he spoke of a young man, how he finds himself in prison and what the outcomes look like. And this is how it correlates to the data. First is that about 48% of Kenyan prisoners are in pretrial detention. So that's in comparison to the 68 to 75% in India. And of this number, 65% of them are young men. These are largely young men who are uneducated or poorly educated, so didn't finish primary school, let alone secondary school. And 68% of them are in there for petty offenses. So offenses that wouldn't attract imprisonment for more than a year. Notwithstanding, they end up in pretrial detention for 2 to 3 years awaiting trial. So a large number of these young men in prison will stay in pretrial detention longer than the sentence that they would eventually have to serve if they were convicted. And in terms of the question of legal aid, we find that 85% of pretrial detainees do not have legal representation. And this then corresponds with a 92% conviction rate in the country. And it essentially reflects a scenario where there's a significant number of young men who are arbitrarily arrested on the streets. And this is obviously mostly in low-income areas and end up in pretrial detention for significant periods of time for petty offenses and have no support. One of the big questions that this raises, and which has been of concern for us, especially on the criminal justice reform side, has been the question of right to bail. Because we find that these numbers are so high, not because the system is necessarily just slow, but because they can't afford the bail terms. And so 95% of these young men and women cannot afford their bail terms. We have people who are being given bail terms of $3,000 when their monthly rent is $30. And this is US dollars. And so the reality of it is that they must spend time in pretrial detention because there are no other alternatives that are offered in terms of how to secure their attendance in court. This obviously brings the question of what is reasonable bail terms, because our constitution in Article 49(1)H talks about having the right to reasonable bail terms unless there are compelling reasons for you not to be granted bail. And so this certainly brings up the question of what reasonable bail terms are. Again, I go back and make reference to India because India is sort of gone ahead of us on a lot of the questions, and even just listening to Justice Lokur on a lot of the questions we are still grappling with, India has gone ahead of us and has gone ahead to define what reasonable bail terms are and whether a person's circumstances should be taken into consideration. What has happened in Kenya is a lot of courts have standardized bail terms. So the bail terms are not related to who you are or what your circumstances are, but to the offense. And so bail terms are fixed at an offense, whether you are a poor person or a rich person, it's standard. And obviously this has come out of the backlash of different courts granting different bail terms for different offenses and what that challenge has been in figuring it out. So a secondary big question that we then end up asking is, what does the right to legal representation look like? Given that there will be no access to lawyers for up to 85% of the people in pretrial detention, what does it look like for the majority of pretrial detainees to actually conduct their cases by themselves? And is it a fair trial if they don't understand what's happening and yet still continue to have to go through a criminal trial? And of course, our courts have found that the question that we ask is on substantial injustice. And they say that substantial injustice is nuanced, but we don't have mandatory legal representation. Our Legal Aid Act puts up about 12 conditions you have to meet before you're granted legal aid. And around means testing, and also around the question of the nature of the offense and your capacity to be able to defend yourself. So pretrial detention in Kenya can be significantly debilitating, because the minute you're unable to get a lawyer, get out of pretrial detention, you lose your job, you're from a low income area. And we can see that there is a very key correlation between poverty and pretrial detention. And there are no solutions that are being offered in terms of what happens once you're released. If you were innocent, for example, what kind of recourse are you offered by the state? A lot of these are questions that we're still grappling with. Another and final point on that I want to make is that 75% of the women in prison in Kenya, and especially in pretrial detention, are in there because of one act. That's the Alcoholic Drinks Control Act. And they're in there because they're essentially brewing illicit alcohol, and again, in the low income areas. And essentially, they are targeted because they don't take out the required licenses. But the fact that there is an overt skewing towards women in prison because of this particular act means that we definitely have to keep researching and asking questions about its enforcement and its correlation to economic crimes, and what systems are being put in place to take care of these women, if indeed we're saying that it's their source of livelihood that's putting them in prison. And so the second thing that I want to talk about, noting that I've taken 7 minutes to talk about pretrial detention, is on the question of courts within or beside prison as a response to terror. And in Kenya, what has happened is we now have 2 courts that are right next to, and in many instances, hold court inside prisons because they're in response to terror cases. And so the government's plan is that in total, there will be at least 8 of these kinds of courts. And it definitely leads us to ask the question of what the framework of justice looks like when we are finding a court inside a prison or beside a prison. And in relation to terror cases, the whole idea of being confined in one place, not being allowed to move from place to place, and what this looks like for solitary confinement. I had the opportunity to develop a manual on management and detention of terror suspects and terror convicts in Kenya last year, a manual which has now been adopted by the Kenya Prison Service. And one of the things that we were encouraging and fighting for, and I've seen the question on the Mandela rules, is that we follow the Mandela rules. And not just that we take an approach that goes away from separating terror suspects in many cases away from the general prison population, and trying to make them interact and not have an individualized identity around that, but also fighting against solitary confinement of terror suspects and terror convicts because of the kind of effects that solitary confinement has on them. And so it's definitely a continuing conversation that we will have in the country. And the last thing that I want to say is around adaptations to COVID, and the fact that, for example, with the pretrial detention, Kenya went into lockdown on the 16th of March, 2020. And since that time, there are people in pretrial detention who have not been to court. They were essentially forgotten. And even the prison officials can't tell when their next dates are. The courts forgot about their files, and unless they complain, it will continue to be that way. And so many of the times when I go into a prison to see clients, or when I go into a prison for any other exercise, there will be people who will approach me and say, "What do we do about this scenario around my case?" They don't know where my file is. They don't know what my next date is. And this is largely related to the lockdown. But the other thing that has happened is we've really tried to then take on technology to respond to these issues. For example, in response to a large number of public interest litigation cases, we've now started holding virtual meetings inside the prisons, because there have been resources deployed there, cameras and laptops that are allowing us to then sit in virtual meetings with our clients. And obviously this then raises questions around confidentiality of the cases, but it's largely better than not having to see your not getting to see your client. And so we've had a series of virtual sessions with clients where we're able to discuss cases, discuss strategy, discuss the way forward, and figure out what the solutions are. And I think there is a larger role for technology to play in prisons in Kenya, but the question on security and how to balance security in the prisons versus how to adapt to technology continues to persist on our end. I think in the end, the question for me, and one of the big issues I will continue to fight and make this bold statement is, what does it look like to abolish pretrial detention or find other ways to ensure that people are attending court outside of imprisonment? Because I think this is a significant question for us to ask. What other alternatives do we have apart from imprisonment to secure people's attendance of court? In Kenya, this is unfortunately the only option that courts see, and they set very high bail terms. But we do believe that there are many solutions. The solutions exist in policy, but because courts sometimes fear being innovative or being pioneers in the sense that they will be singled out, they will not look for those solutions or look at the solutions even though they exist in policy. So it's a question we'll continue to grapple with until we're able to find alternative ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gilbert, for that very illuminating, as I said, also for our previous speaker, for General Justice Lokur, because he picked up very effectively from where he had left off. And you brought in these very critical issues of the conditionality of access to legal aid, which is really quite amazing. The 10 layers of difference, shall we say, or 10 layers of inaccess. And the fact that, and this is true, I think, in most countries of the world, certainly in most countries of the Commonwealth, where we are governed by these century-old laws, where essentially you find that those who are in prison, a majority of those in prison, whether it's pre-trial or otherwise, are either too poor to post bail or meet bail terms, as you said, and have little faith in the judicial system. And many of them are there for petty crimes. I mean, the whole criminalization of petty crimes of petty offenses is something that we do really need to, because I was just talking earlier today to my colleague from Accra and how they're campaigning on decriminalizing petty offenses. Because a lot of the problems that we find, certainly in the Commonwealth, is really a legacy problem. Going back more than 100 years, the police law in India goes back 140 years. The prison law goes back 120 years. We've just been tweaking it. We haven't revolutionized it because it's just easier for people to live with the status quo rather than make changes. Thank you very much, Gilbert, and also for pointing out that the hope of technology brings with it an additional problem, which is the lack of confidentiality. But then how do you can you balance these things or not? You know, that's a thing we left for. Now, I'd like to thank the panelists, and I'd like to go to the next part of this conversation, which is really calling on two interventions from the floor. The first will be from Dr. Patricia Perez Goldberg, who's Chile's former Minister for Justice and began a legal career in 2000, was in the Office of the Public Defender in our country for a decade. And as Minister for Justice, Dr. Perez, if I may say so, you're probably the youngest Minister of Justice in your country, or perhaps in many countries. And you led the defense and protection of human rights, created the Undersecretariat for Human Rights, and her latest book, she has many achievements to her credit. The latest book is Women in Prison and the Capabilities Approach. And a very good bit of news for the new year is that Dr. Perez will be joining the Inter-American Court of Human Rights for the 5-year term from 2022 to 2027. So Dr. Perez, thank you for joining us. We are privileged to have you. And can you please make your remarks? Thank you.
Thanks, Sanjoy. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I am very honored to participate in this book presentation, which is, of course, not only the journey of a lifetime, but it also poses several very important questions about the present and the future of prisons. Just a word, I wasn't thinking in talking about Chile, but just a few words, just linking to what Justice Lokur has said, and also Gilbert, about the two aspects about pretrial detention and about the absolute need to have a specialized legal aid. In Chile, we had a transformation of the criminal system from the year 2000 ahead, and this has allowed us, even though we still have many challenges to face, this has allowed us to really diminish the population that are in waiting for their sentences in pretrial detention. And nowadays, the pretrial detention population is only 36%. And also the investment in the public defender's office has allowed us to have specialized lawyers and also social workers working with the convicted. So this has allowed the people who are in prison to have better conditions. And it's been really, I think, in my opinion, it has been a really a step ahead within all of the challenges we still face in our country. Regarding the book, I would briefly wanted to comment two topics. The first of all, the chapter about Latin America. And I think Professor Coyle is absolutely right that some of the most problematic prisons are in the region, are to be found in this region. I would like to reflect in what could be called the paradox of security. Because first of all, security can be considered one of the main preoccupations of the populations across Latin America. And second, that the demand for security has traditionally been answered in the region through increasing the number of police officers, elevating the length of sentences, and also expanding the prison system, broadly speaking, building more facilities and incarcerating more people. In general, there has been reluctance to acknowledge that the prison system is one of the main components of a public policy truly oriented towards prevention and therefore higher level of securities. Consequently, there has been a lack of a long-term penitentiary public policy. This situation, in my view, has produced three principal implications. First of all, absence of understanding about the absolute need to assess the moral performance of prisons, field to which Professor Alison Liebling, as we all know, has dedicated so much effort, and ignoring the central role that human relationships play in that performance. In the words of Professor Coyle, the key to a well-managed prison is the relationship between prisoners and staff, and that the latter need to be recruited carefully and then well-trained, end of quote. Secondly, absence of intergovernmental coordination to address the causes that bring vulnerable groups into custody, such as lack of education, housing, health services, violence. And third of all, as Professor Coyle points out, the absence of appropriate political oversight and strategic direction, one of which signs is the frequent change of authorities. All these factors have contributed to different degrees of iron fist or mano dura measures, which have worsened the plight of the incarcerated and haven't helped to increase public security at all. Regarding the chapter about women, I appreciated not only the content, but the place of this chapter in the book at the beginning, contributing to visualize their reality. For incarcerated women, inequality is especially harsh. While all women face, in general, structural inequality and have fewer chances for expanding their capabilities, incarcerated women face especially unforgiving conditions, including a loss of family and community ties that exacerbates their vulnerabilities. As such, addressing their plight is indispensable if sustainable development goals are to reach the whole of society. Human development and related rights gain legitimacy when they include groups just as these that lack power, visibility, and standing across the political process. Achieving these goals requires gender-sensitive measures that are capable of correcting or at least mitigating the prevailing structural inequality. These obligations apply to states as a whole, including the judiciary, of course, which must ensure that policy initiatives are guided by the rights that are underlying the democratic legitimacy and the rule of law. Unfortunately, this is a problem of our region. The dogmatic enforcement that is a trait of Latin America's legal culture militates against a rights-based approach. In his final chapter, Towards a Better Way, Professor Coyle has proposed that perhaps, and I quote here, many of the issues that have traditionally been dealt with through criminal justice processes might be resolved more appropriately within a more comprehensive human development approach. In the same vein, I think there is a potential value to judges of the capability theory based on sense assertion that human rights are entitlements to capabilities. The capability approach may be an especially appropriate policy guide in advancing and encouraging sustainable development in line with UN goals, and may provide judges with a tool to guide policy initiatives in a manner that is consistent with the law. Well, dear Andrew, just as somebody told you in Peterhead a number of years ago, one thing, and this is a quote, but I really interprets me, and I'm sure it interprets all of you, is that one thing we all respect you for is that you never give up and you just keep coming back for more. So this outstanding work is just a proof of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Perez, for those very warm words for Andrew, and for a brief deep dive, shall we say, into the issues not just before Latin America, but before prisons of the world. And the points that you made very specifically on how it is so important for human relationships to be nurtured. And the point about the staff need to be very carefully recruited and well-trained. I mean, that is so critical. And it's like the last of the priorities of every government. Prisons, although many politicians have been to jail, once they come out and they get into power, they forget about it. They forget about how bad it was. They forget how bad the food was. They forget how bad the toilets were. They forget how bad the company was, or maybe they forget about how badly they were treated by the staff. The company must have been fine. But thank you for joining us and for your thoughts, and especially since this undergirds your own book, the capability approach. That this is something that judges need to review and look at in the way they look at the issue of prisoners and incarceration. The next intervention and the last intervention before we open it up to questions for a short while is my colleague Madhurima Dhanuka, who was associated with Catherine Hurd's project. She's a lawyer and head of our prison reforms team in Access to Justice at the CHRI. Madhurima is based in Calcutta. She has made presentations and spoken and been resource persons at various UN and national and international programs and forums. I'm also glad to announce that she and I are the co-editors. This is a bit of a self-pitch, so forgive me, because And Dr. Perez has spoken about her book, and I've spoken about her book. Andrew is promoted. This is all about his book and his life work. We are also co-editors of a forthcoming book on Indian prisons, which will be published by Pan Macmillan. So Madhuriba, I am giving you the floor.
Thank you, Sanjay. So definitely this has been a much thought-provoking session. And what we've heard today are probably some of the key issues that plague prison systems across the world. I think that's the that's the similar vein that I've come to realize after having attended several international and national programs. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. It doesn't matter how much money prisons have. Probably does, but then not entirely, because sometimes when you read the reports on all that goes on inside a prison, you can't believe that to be true, or you don't believe that we are still in that world or in the civilized world. So yes, some of the points I'd like to make is about, and I think that's going to resonate with a lot of people who are listening in today, is I felt that because of the pandemic, whatever progress prison reforms took in the last decades has probably been unraveled. I recently visited prison nearly after a year and a half, and everything that I saw was a stark reminder of how lack of visitation, monitoring, recreation, it's made prisons again that closed space, removed from the public eye. And also, we really still don't know how what the physical and mental trauma has been of COVID on prisoners, their families, and also the prison staff. Prisons were known to be a closed space. COVID, I think, made it even more closed. And I think that lack of oversight, that lack of insight has really impacted, and we still don't know what those impacts are going to be. So as practitioners in this space, I believe we need to be prepared for what's going to come next. There's going to be increased overcrowding, lengthier duration of trial proceedings, reduced economic capacities linked to the ability to hire effective defense counsels. Reduced state budgets for criminal justice institutions will also be one of the, one of the impacts of the pandemic. And we will be releasing some data soon about Indian prison population, and it's not as what we would have hoped for. The pandemic has not meant less number of prisoners; it's meant more number of prisoners. The duration of stays have increased. The percentage of people in prison has also increased. As Justice Lokur also mentioned, pretrial detention rates have also increased. So I really fear, what exactly the figures are going to state. And I think we need to give a deep thought to what Professor Coyle has rightly stated in his book about justice reinvestment idea. And I think we need to chart our interventions in future accordingly. So on that note, I'm going to hand the floor back to Sanjay. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhuriba. I thought you would take a few more minutes and speak a bit longer. However, what I would like to do is, if it's possible, we have, I think, a question or two in the chat box, and if Aditya can read the question or questions, and then if anybody wishes to, from the floor, to ask a question, they're welcome to. But I would then think of handing it back to the panel for very brief closing remarks, and then over to Andrew. So could we have the question? Is it? Oh, this is by Alan Mitchell, I think. I think all of you can see that question. To what extent does the panel believe that softer laws such as the Nelson Mandela rules and the European prison rules, given the resource invested in the development in practical terms, really, I'm sorry, I'm missing this.
Sanjoy, it's been shifted to the chat box.
Okay, have you seen it?
Yeah, it's there in the chat box.
Okay, so who would like to? I'd really give it back to the panel and to Andrew.
Sanjoy, Can I pick up
Yes,
on that
please
one?
come in.
And the brief answer to Dr. Alan Mitchell, who is of course, the president of the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture, is yes, they are important. And two brief comments as to why they're important. Why are, for example, the Nelson Mandela minimum standard rules important? Why are all the regional instruments which we have important? The first one is that, as we've heard this morning, there are a number of countries and administrations which would like to do much better in the way that they administer their prisons, but they're not quite sure how to do it. Catherine gave us one example from Thailand, and I think Gilbert referred to others. So they are a very useful reference point in many countries. That's the first reason. The second reason is of particular interest, I think, to the president of the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture, which is that in the early 1990s, when the Committee for the Prevention of Torture was set up, it inspects prisons in every country in the greater European region, which has signed the Convention Against Torture. There was an unspoken expectation that these rules would be very useful for countries in Central and Eastern Europe, which were just coming out of the Soviet times and were entering the wider European community. It would be good for them to have to be inspected in this way and to have attention drawn to their failings. Something else happened. They came first, in the first year, they came to the United Kingdom. And in the United Kingdom, they found that a number of the prisons were inhuman and degrading in their treatment of prisoners. They went to Scandinavia the next year, and they criticized the tradition in Scandinavia of keeping remand prisoners in virtual solitary confinement during their period of remand. And both countries and other Western European countries responded really quite aggressively, saying, why are you criticizing us? The committee was not set up to criticize us. It was set up for other countries. And I think that could be replicated around the world. So that's rather an extended answer to Dr. Alan Mitchell. Yes, absolutely, they're important. And you should please continue your important work. Thank you.
I wonder if Justice Lokur would like to come in, because the issue of custodial violence and custodial torture is very well known and recorded and documented in India, certainly. And he's, I think, reflected on this in numerous times. So, Justice Lokur.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Sanjoy. We have referred to the Nelson Mandela rules in our judgment, and we have impressed upon the state, mainly the government of India, to try and adopt the principles and include them in the model prison manual. Now the problem is that, you see, even if it's there in the model prison manual and even if it is adopted and so on, the fact is that there's a lot of difference between theory and practice. So it is one thing for the government to say, oh yes, we think the Nelson Mandela rules are very good and we adopt them. But in practice, if you see instances of torture, you hear instances of violence, extortion rackets, by the way, were recently uncovered from the prison in Delhi, which is supposed to be the largest prison in Asia, or at least in South Asia, and perhaps one of the best prisons, so it is said, in this region. So you've had extortion rackets coming from there, Now they found something like 127 mobile phones inside the prison. So they've had to, put in CCTV cameras and all that. So there's a huge gap between theory and practice. 2 points that I would just like to quickly mention in the context of what Gilbert said. I'm seeing a trend, Gilbert, that bail conditions in India are becoming somewhat harsher. The 99% of Indians earn 118,000 rupees a year, 99%. And in the recent past, I've been noticing that in many of the bail orders that are given, the bail bond is for 50,000 rupees, which is roughly 40% of the annual income of 99% of the people of India. How many people can actually afford such a bail bond? Number one. Number two, we had provided computers to every prison in India so that, routine work, production of prisoners and so on could be taken care of. But to my surprise, many of them did not use the computers. So I asked them when I was chairman of the computer committee, I asked them, why aren't you using the computers? Their answer was that, you haven't paid us for the internet connection. So please give us some money and then we'll start using it. So, there are ways and means in which, prison officials can create problems for prisoners. I like to call this soft torture, where it's not physical, but it's some kind of harassment which could amount to soft torture. Thank you.
Thank you. I see that Madhurima has a point she'd like to make, but Catherine and Gilbert, do you also want to come in after Madhurima? But let Madhurima speak first, and then perhaps Patricia also, Perez also has a point. Okay, Madhurima, quickly.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to respond on Mr. Allen's question point about soft laws and if they are actually useful or not. But from somebody who engages a lot on training as well, they are, I'm sorry for the noise, but yeah, I think soft laws are very important, and they actually help in providing guidance to us, because they lay down the foundations and principles that one has to adhere to. In that way, yes, we use it a lot in our trainings and other work that we do on prison reforms here. I just wanted to make that point.
Right. I see that Patricia Perez has raised her hand. So would you like to come in briefly? And I think the other two, and then I'll hand it back to Andrew.
Okay. Thanks, Sanjo. Just commenting on Alan's question, I think also that it's very important. Just thinking about experience in my country, basically at 3 levels. At the political level, for instance, the Mandela rules were a very important inspiration to implement the law that gave alternatives to incarceration, and that contributed to reduce the scope of incarceration in the country. And it was directly inspired by the Mandela rules. And also in what is related to the training of the staff, now the prison reform has a human rights unit, and the human rights unit continually gives training considering all the broad, not only the covenants, but also the guides and recommendations of the UN and of the OAS. And at a judicial level, because, for instance, we had a case recently that concerned a woman that was taken to the hospital and gave birth, and she was shackled. It was a very tremendous case, and the Supreme Court ruled based upon the Bangkok rules. And so that contributed to spread this view across all the courts, and I think it was a very good decision. So to your question, I think they're very important. They should be continue to be so. Thank you.
Before the others come in, we have actually a question from Mr. Rathi, who used to be executive director of the National Legal Services Authority, and now is an senior executive in the Supreme Court. The right of prison inmates to have real-time access to developments and progress in their trials is often flouted. And he says that the language is also a problem because it may not be, the language either of the court or of the trial may not be a language they're familiar with. So would somebody like to come to that? I mean, is that a problem in other geographies? I think Justice Lokur and
Well, I'm happy to make a couple of remarks on that.
Yeah, please do.
I mean, first of all, the broad problem of the law being necessary but not sufficient, as indicated by the earlier question, when it goes to the issue of pre-trial detention as well, and the continuing right of prisoners to have access to legal advice after conviction, because of course they then will need legal advice and representation on a number of matters, particularly in countries like India and England and many of the others that we looked at that make extraordinarily high use of the life sentence and other indeterminate sentences. I mean, access to parole is a major problem in such situations. But on the specific question of technology, of course, it can help to make real these theoretical rights of prisoners and pretrial detainees to not be detained arbitrarily and to have access to legal advice and the right to understand the language of the proceedings, which can entail use of interpreting and translation. I mean, in this day and age, a huge number of detainees around the world are non-nationals to the country of imprisonment, and that becomes all the more important. But I would just say that if you're imprisoning the numbers of people that we're talking about in much of the world, these vast proportions of whom are often pretrial detainees, it's going to cost an awful lot of money to provide them with legal advice, with interpretation and translation, and with the technology that will enable them to participate in hearings. So first of all, before we set ambitions that are never going to be realized because they would be too expensive, let's address the fundamental need to be more proportionate in our use of imprisonment, to make sure that we are only detaining pre-trial in exceptional circumstances and not doing the kind of box ticking that Justice Lokur was talking about when there are sort of clearly frameworks for decision making, but they're just not applied in practice because individual judges and courts don't feel that they have the time, or they are not willing to do more than a rubber stamping exercise. And there's a lot of risk aversion at bail decision making and again at sentencing, because of these days, as our research showed, the amount of pressure on judges to seem tough and to not be the ones that made the decision by the one person that happens to be given bail and commits an offence whilst on bail. And these cases are so vanishingly rare, but they always are the ones that influence the tightening up of bail laws, as we saw in Australia a couple of years ago when somebody committed a hostage siege whilst out on bail for a fairly serious allegation. But it's those bad laws that they will emerge from this small number of hard cases, and we see it time and again. So I think it is vital to ensure that justice is paid for and justice is funded and resourced. But first of all, we need far fewer numbers and far more proportionate use of incarceration. And just briefly on Gilbert's point about the vast quantity of prisoners actually incarcerated for petty offences, it's not that they would go to the prison for the first such offence. In many cases, they might face a fine. But if they can't pay the fine, and if they keep repeating the same types of petty offences, as they're often forced to for economic reasons, then they will be clogging up the pre-trial justice system, the court system, And it's not just colonial era offences either. It's new offences being brought in for things like breaching COVID rules, COVID restrictions, lockdown restrictions, and protesting. We're seeing so much more criminalisation of people protesting. So I've covered a lot of other points that people had made there in my answer, but I think I have, hopefully answered some of those points too.
Thank you. I think we are actually at a time when, I know, Gilbert, you want to make a point very briefly, because I think we are coming to the end of our session. But before you do that, I would just like to point out, there is the Convention Against Torture, which has been referred to. There are only 9 countries of the world which haven't signed, and they include, if I'm not mistaken, Brunei, Bahamas, Saint Thomas and Principe, Angola, Comoros, Gambia, and Palau, Sudan, and India. There are 9 countries that have signed the CAT. And that is really something that all of us need to work to ensure that they come on board. But Gilbert, over to you, and then I won't say anything more. I'll hand it back to Andrew. Thank you.
I just wanted to say on the question of Mandela rules, that what happened after the Mandela rules came out is civil society organizations in Kenya then came up with a checklist on compliance with Mandela rules, and then went about the country training the prisons and the prison officers and management on the Mandela rules, and then taking them through the checklist and saying, on this particular area, how are you doing? How do you assess it? How do you plan to improve it? And then in partnership with prison leadership coming in to then say, at any time when anyone comes in to check, what is the level of compliance with Mandela rules? And to that extent, it has really, really, caused a shift in how prisoners are being treated, and also made its way into the manual that we then prepared on management of terror suspects and convicts, which was then adopted by the prisons as well. So to a large extent, Mandela rules have come into very regular common use in Kenya, just because there was some sense of guideline or codification of those particular rules, so that the prison officers could also understand what they're about and what their level of participation or engagement should look like in relation to those particular rules. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
And also
to
say,
sorry,
just the last thing, very lastly, on Kenya has about over 40 languages. And so many times people will come into courts and will not understand the standard languages of English or Swahili. So what then tends to happen is we have translators in every single court. And because the judiciary has now made a point of recruiting from every different tribe, then that means in every single court station, we will have people who court staff, judiciary staff, who can speak multiple languages, who then act as translators for those who come in and are unable to understand either English or Swahili. And just without technology, that's one way in which Kenya has been able to adapt to language barriers in those contexts.
There are best practices we can learn from each other. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity and practice that you have outlined, in which I think many countries which are represented here and elsewhere could learn from. But I want to thank all of you for being such great panelists and for your patience and joining at different times from across the world. And I hand it back to the author of the book, who is also the star of the show and the hero of our story, Andrew Coyle.
Thank you, Sanjoy. Gosh, I am covered in embarrassment. I wonder if I could very briefly comment on another issue which has been raised, which is that of open prisons. There has been a tradition in recent years in many countries to close down open prisons, only to build very large prisons and prisons which have very high security and which therefore are very expensive to administer, and also make it much more difficult for prisoners to maintain their contact in the community. So apart from looking to alternatives to prison, we should also look, I think, at the need for increased availability of small open prisons. But let me conclude, Sanjoy, by repeating my thanks to you for your expert chairmanship today, and to Madhurima and Aditya and your colleagues at the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative in New Delhi, who have been our hosts today. I should also express my thanks to colleagues at the Population Foundation of India for their generous technical assistance. And my thanks to my fellow presenters, Catherine, Mandan, Gilbert, and Patricia Perez Goldberg from Chile. Finally, my thanks to everyone who has joined us today from around the world. I know that some of you from the Americas have risen very early to be with us, and others from the opposite hemisphere may have stayed up past their usual bedtime. My thanks to you all. I have certainly been given much food for further thought today, and I hope that you have all found this a worthwhile experience. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Thank you all very much. And you've got another book now, Andrew, waiting for you as a result of this discussion.
It's on the trail, it's on the tracks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Gilbert.
Thank
you,
you.
Patricia. Thank you, Justice Lokur.
Thank you.
And my
Thank
Bye.
team from
Patricia.
CHRI and
Thank you,
PFI.
Thank you, Gilbert.